And he ends with a monologue that's written as if Pushkin were walking on water. He tries to get out of it by saying, how is it possible that I'm not a genius? Didn't the creator of the Vatican kill people? Don't people kill other people? Isn't it possible? But no matter what he says, he knows very well that Mozart has defined him, at least as Pushkin regards him, as a total mediocrity. Mediocrity cannot become a genius, no matter how many other powerful things he has at his disposal. Schaffer's film, called Amadeus, catches many parts of the Pushkin play very well, although it's not totally parallel by any means. It's quite different from the Pushkin play, although the idea is taken from Pushkin, as Schaffer admits openly. There's one particular scene that's very close to the spirit of Pushkin, in which Mozart is first introduced to the King of Austria at that time, a man named Joseph. Joseph is pictured in the film, by the way, as something of a duffer in music, which is totally untrue. According to all the historical sources, King Joseph was a very good musician. But in the play, Salieri has prepared a little piece in honor of Mozart, and the king says, oh, wouldn't it be delightful if I could play it? That is, the king wants to play it. Of course, Salieri naturally would not refuse that from a king, and the king says, bring Mozart in slowly. This is supposed to be an interview with Mozart. Bring Mozart in slowly while I practice. And as the king starts to practice, he literally murders the piece of music. Finally, the young Mozart, who's been waiting outside, waiting to see the king, comes into the room as the king is murdering the music, and there's an interchange between him, that is Mozart, the king, and also the court musicians who are there, very jealous of the fantastic reputation this young Mozart has built up in a very short time. They're not all happy about the interview, but the king wants to see Mozart, so they have to accept him. Mozart discusses how he's going to do an opera in German, away from the usual operas, which are always done in Italian. Of course, the court musicians who are Italians don't like this either. At the end of the scene, the king says, well, it's very nice to have met you. I'm going to give you the manuscript of the piece Salieri composed for you. You can hold this manuscript as a souvenir of this meeting. Mozart says, oh, that's not necessary. I already know it. The king says, what do you mean you already know it? Where do you have it? And Mozart points to his head and says, I have it right here in my head. The king is skeptical and tells Mozart to prove it. Well, Mozart sits down, we know what kind of a pianist he was and what kind of a musical memory he had, and proceeds to play through perfectly the piece that the king had messed up and bollocksed. And while the king had messed up when the king was trying to play it, Mozart is a great pianist, as you all know, but Mozart says, but Salieri, he plays it through, it's a very simple melody, that doesn't quite work, does it? And he begins to improvise themes that we, of course, know very well from some of Mozart's operas. Soon as Mozart starts to improvise, the whole court stops and the people come gathering in around him. And of course, the more successfully Mozart plays it, and the more beautiful the music becomes, the more furious Salieri becomes. He vows that somehow or other he's going to stop this man. Now, this particular scene is very close to the spirit of the Pushkin play. Schaffer captures it very well. And as a matter of fact, in Mozart's life, this actually happened, not with Salieri, but rather in Paris. As you may know, the young Mozart had come to Paris to try to make it in the musical world there. He went to a salon where he did with an Italian musician something very similar to what he does to Salieri in the play. The Italian musician swore Mozart would never again get into a French musical salon. The result was that the French lost Mozart. Just think for a moment what French music might be like today if they had taken in Mozart instead of casting him out and forcing him back to Vienna and to Viennese music. All of these ironies are very much connected to what Pushkin was talking about, and I find them very moving. Moving us very much in the direction of exactly who and what Pushkin was. Now, Pushkin, as you know, thought very highly of his own talent. I think I mentioned to you once before that he considered himself the Mozart of the 19th century, and you see this very clearly in Mozart and Salieri. Yet, there was another poet toward whom Pushkin looked with great admiration and perhaps even a little bit of envy. This was the famous Polish poet, contemporary with Pushkin. The poet's name was Adam Mickiewicz, who had been exiled from Poland into Petersburg at that time because he had been involved in some revolutionary societies that the Tsar was not very happy about. You know that Poland was very restless under Russian rule at that time. Mickiewicz and Pushkin became rather good friends. Pushkin particularly admired Mickiewicz's ability to improvise a poem in various languages. He could improvise in Polish and in French. He might also have been able to do it in Russian. I'm not quite sure about that. All you had to do was to give him a theme or a topic, and immediately, without thinking, he would bring forth a poem in full poetic style and form, which examined precisely and accurately the theme he had been given and did not know anything about before it was given to him. Pushkin exclaimed, "What genius! What sacred fire! What am I compared to him?" That's, you understand, quite a come down from a man who considered himself the Mozart of the 19th century. Pushkin then proceeded to write a story in which the improviser is presented as an Italian. He uses the Italian language. He calls him improvvisatore. It's a story clearly based on his relationship to Mickiewicz, the brilliant improviser. The title of the story is Egipetskie Noci, meaning Egyptian Nights. The story opens in the apartment of an aristocratic poet named Charsky, and clearly Pushkin has put into Charsky many of the characteristics that Pushkin himself had. As a matter of fact, the epigram, which clearly applies to the improviser, is, "Who is this man?" The answer in the epigram is, "A great talent. He makes from his voice everything that he wishes." To this comes the reply, "He would do well, madame, to make a pair of pants out of that voice." The terrible need of the Italian improviser in the story is reflected in the epigram. Charsky, on the other hand, is having a delightful morning for a poet. He's sitting in his study, which is very well appointed. He's a poet, but he's also an aristocrat. He takes great pains to hide the fact that he's a poet from the people around him, because if he lets people know he's a poet, they'll tell him to write a poem about this or that, or torture him endlessly, or look down on him because he's a poet, because after all, a poet can't really be an aristocrat. For many different reasons, he tries to hide the fact. Pushkin rather ironically says, the only privilege a poet enjoys, he puts this, of course, in the mouth of Charsky, but it's clearly also from Pushkin, the only privilege a poet enjoys is poetic license. You know, I don't know that poets have any particular license of freedom other than maybe being able to use the genitive case instead of the ablative case. That's not a very big deal, although to tell you that for someone like me who studied the language grammatically, it is a big deal. He goes on to say, there was not that kind of disorder which shows the presence of the muse and the absence of the broom and the brush. In other words, what Pushkin is saying is that your normal poet lives in great disorder in the way that Beethoven used to live, but an aristocrat lives so that there's no absence of cleanliness and all of those things that make up a comfortable apartment. While he's working in the morning, when the rhymes are coming beautifully, all of a sudden somebody rushes in and he's quite angry. That time when inspiration is upon him, he doesn't want to be interrupted. He says, nobody should come in. He says, who the devil are you? How dare you interrupt me when I'm trying to get something done in poetry? The intruder, of course, is not expecting this. He retreats in dismay, and then he makes Charsky aware of the fact that he's an improvvisatore. Oh, said Charsky, that's different. His anger immediately dissipates. You mean to say that you can take any theme, any poem without any music, background, or preparation, and say it exactly the way you want to do it? The intruder says, well, give me a try. Well, Charsky gives him a theme, very actual for Russia in all of its history. He says, the crowd has no right to dictate what a poet writes. A poet is free to choose anything he chooses. Imagine the effect this made during Soviet times when the Soviets were telling poets exactly what to write. The poem was obviously written by Pushkin, but he gives this Italian improviser one of his most beautiful poems, including the lines, for the heart of a young woman there is no law, and a poet is exactly the same, just like Aquilon, the god of the wind. Whatever he wants, he blows it in that direction. And just as the god of the air can blow the wind in any direction, so the poet can turn in any direction he chooses. Charsky is overwhelmed with the beauty of the poem. He asks, how do you do it without anything to help you? The improviser replies, any talent is unexplainable. The inexplicability of genius is very well examined here. Then suddenly, almost without a pause, he said, now, you've agreed to set up an evening for me. How much can we charge for the evening? Charsky is suddenly thrown from the heaven of poetry, the height of poetic inspiration, to mercantile considerations of how much should he charge, what should he wear, what should the lighting be. Quite a jolt to Charsky, who, being a true aristocrat, does not like mixing poetry with mercantile and even theatrical events. The Italian is a genuine improvvisatore who knows all too well how important the matter of money is to a poet who is nevertheless producing these great things of inspiration. Well, in any case, the evening takes place. It's an evening in St. Petersburg. The improvvisatore comes in dressed in a very impressive way, and Charsky is a little put off by the theatricality of the costume, but he comes to understand it. So the evening begins. The improvvisatore says to the audience, which is made up very largely of young Petersburg women who want to be seen in a place where they can show off they know some Italian, since he's going to do it in the Italian language, he says, now, would you be so kind as to give me some themes to improvise upon, and I will pick one of them. Well, they're shy and embarrassed, and of course the shyness, their unwillingness to participate in poetry is a point that Pushkin is making here about the society. There's something that holds them back in the conventions of their society. Finally, after a certain amount of clumsiness, Charsky, in order to break the ice, drops a piece of paper in the urn that's being passed around, and this does break the ice because then others drop in papers. Then the improvisatore pulls them out, and he sees Cleopatra and her lovers. And with wonderful irony, he says, "Will the person who suggested this please tell me which one?" And in Italian he says, "Perché la grande regina n'aveva molto," because the great queen had many lovers. Charsky then confesses, he pretends, that it was he who put in the theme of Cleopatra and her lovers. There's great relief on the part of the people in society. At last the improvisation is going to go forward. He says, "I had in mind the time when Cleopatra offered her love to any man at her feast, on the condition of having given him her love, that man the next morning would feel the executioner's axe." At this point, the poet goes into a kind of a trance for the construction of the poem. The music starts, and he comes forth. Well, it turns out there were 3 men who came forward. One was a warrior who was tired of life and wanted to end his life, and of course would naturally like to sleep with Cleopatra. Another had a very difficult life, a man whose wife made his life hell, so he was willing to have at least one good night of sex before he was killed. Then a third young man who barely had hair growing on his chin, and Cleopatra looks at him with a sort of sadness and nostalgia, as if she's almost reluctant to let him do it. But in any case, it takes place, and she says, «Клянусь, о матерь наслаждений, тебе неслыханно служу, на ложе страстной искушений простой наемницы схожу. I swear, O mother of all pleasures, I serve you without question. On the couch of strong passions I will come as a simple hireling. Но только утренней порфирой Аврора вечная блеснет, клянусь, под смертною секирой глава счастливцев отпадет. But only at the morning's purple, when the sun comes up, I swear that under the mortal axe the heads of the happy ones will go." Thus was quoted Cleopatra, a hireling for love. With the drama of the relationship between Mozart and Salieri, and the contrast of Cleopatra's ancient world and the part of the 19th century Petersburg which we see in this story, Pushkin is making his own statements about talent and mediocrity. Clearly, his view of his own position is not always consistent. This ambiguity adds to the richness and many-sidedness of his poetry and art. But ambiguity or not, Pushkin clearly considers himself on the side of genius, far from mediocrity. So we have here the society of St. Petersburg, from which Pushkin absolutely could not separate himself, within which he always had to go. He always had to have the latest gossip. He always had to be with the most beautiful women. He always had to hear from his friends what was happening in the court. He had to know everything about St. Petersburg, and yet this very same St. Petersburg, which was the basis of so much inspiration for his poetry, so much of his love of Russia, so much of the grandeur with which he associated Russia and Peter the Great, this very St. Petersburg had a society which was the essence of mediocrity, where people couldn't even furnish a theme for a poet who was trying to improvise. A society which came eagerly to an evening to hear the poetry, but which couldn't participate in it in the way, you notice the story is called Египетские ночи, Egyptian Nights. Obviously, in ancient Egypt, at least in the imagination of Pushkin, in ancient Egypt, passions could be expressed. Passions were clear. Cleopatra was the queen, and Cleopatra was the essence of passion. How different that was from his Petersburg, and how well that's brought out by this poem. And of course, in this again, we get a great statement about society, about poetry, and about mediocrity.